Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero. Our guest today is Dr. Greg Daddis. He's an associate professor of history and the director of the MA program in War and Society at Chapman University. Prior to that position, he was the chief of the American History Division in the Department of History at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He retired from the Army as a colonel, having served our country in Operations Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom. Dr. Daddis sat down with Pete and Scott in the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California, on what happened to be Nixon's birthday. And they were joined, at least chiming in out of the background, by Army Private Craig Clements. It's an interesting episode. We hope you enjoy it, ladies and gentlemen. Our special guest, Dr. Greg Daddis.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Greg Daddis, professor of history and director of the MA program in War and Society at Chapman University, and you're listening to The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Well, Scott set this one up, so I'm going to tee it up to Scott. Scott.
Yeah. Well, he omitted a couple of other honorifics, like Colonel, United States Army. We're always...
Let me sit straighter up.
Yes, like your body, Turner. He's the position of attention. And also, what was your final rank? We have Craig Clements in the studio here at the Nixon Library today. What was your final rank? Private, like your body. Yeah.
Right.
So Craig is the senior enlisted here, but he was a private, so he's going to be on the working party as well. So we're happy to have Craig here. And Greg, great to have you on the Break It Down show. So I think what's cool, too, is not only as we sit here at Nixon Library on the, was it 102nd?
106
commemoration of his birthday, yeah. And how Greg and I met, and Craig, all through this organization at Nixon. And I think it's brought another group of vets that were running different circles. Right. I mean, but what's unique too is, and I want to turn it over to Greg, is we run in some of the same circles too. He's more higher level academia, but we're also writers.
Yeah.
Greg is a published author of several books on history. And I think when you and I talked about, we've been trying to get you in the studio and get on the pod. But I think that's really what the driving factor was. You have such a unique background. We have similar backgrounds. I wanted to ask you questions during this episode, Greg, of like, what drove you to get to where you are now? Like, let's turn back the clock a little bit. Tell everybody listening to the pod how you started in this.
Yeah.
What drove you to the Army, and then how you do what you do now.
Yeah, thanks. So I'd like to say that patriotism drove me to the Army, but that's not at all what happened. It was basically not having enough money to go to college. I grew up in a modest household in New Jersey, God's country, the Garden State. I was looking for opportunities after high school, and my parents said, the best we can do is Rutgers. Nothing bad against Rutgers.
Yeah, that's not a disparaging comment.
And, my junior year of high school, we had a cadet from West Point who was home for Thanksgiving break that came early to visit local high schools and had no idea what West Point was. My dad spent a few years in the Air Force and started doing some more research and found out that there was this amazing opportunity that obviously came with a pretty good price tag. And everything worked out. And so, it's interesting. I think my views on service and being a military officer have really evolved over time. That I joined and went to West Point for the sole reason of looking for
I was waiting for him to drop that bomb. Like, oh, by the way, West Point.
Yeah.
So, which is not a school like Rutgers. They don't just let.
No, but I think that was a driving motivation when you're a young high school kid, right? That this was an opportunity to get out of New Jersey, not far, obviously, but to really kind of expand your worldview through a service academy.
Let me ask you a couple questions about that then. So you find out about this as a junior. So you must have been pretty academically inclined and working hard, or?
Yeah, I was doing pretty well. My parents.
When I was a junior, I was just trying to get someone else to touch them. stuff?
I think because I was so unsuccessful at that, that I was looking for alternatives. So,
but I mean, you have to be marketable to get that education.
Yeah.
And if you're not playing football or whatever. And what was your sport?
I was a runner. Yeah,
okay.
I did cross country and track. So I was too skinny to be on the football team. Our football team wasn't very good anyway, so I wasn't missing out on much. But yeah, I think it was an opportunity to, I was doing well in school, and it was an opportunity to kind of get into that higher level education, not having the funding to do it, which really says something. I think, not to get sounded too political and social, but you're already seeing, even back in the mid '80s, this kind of disparity in terms of opportunities for education that are part of our debate now, more recently, in terms of what's available in terms of education.
What would you have done without the military academy at West Point?
Probably made a huge mistake, right? Because I was looking, all my friends were going into engineering. And I'm like, well, all my friends are going to engineering. So they're going to like Tulane and Virginia Tech and all these places. I'm like, well, if that's where all my friends are going to do engineering, I had no idea about engineering. I'm awful at math. I turned into a historian. So I would have been some miserable engineer that probably wasn't any good at his job. Because I didn't have any other opportunity.
So were you a follower, or would you lump yourself in that? Like, I was going to follow the rest of the pack.
Oh yeah, early on, without a
leadership was something that
and
you learned.
I've told my daughter this throughout, that I didn't grow up until halfway through West Point, and probably really grew up when I was a lieutenant.
I'm waiting to tell my daughter this. Not about you, about me. When I grow up. Right. So, man.
But in terms of maturing, it happened at the latter stages of West Point, and certainly happened, I think, when I was a lieutenant. So in terms of kind of understanding who I was as a person and following.
I like to press that button because I think it's important, because a lot of people always, especially a guy who's as accomplished as you, who's done so much, and that is a lot. You'll always downplay it. You're so super humble. It drives me nuts. You've done so much, but it takes a really remarkable person to share. I think that you weren't always like this. I wasn't born a colonel in the U.S. Army fighting bad guys in Iraq.
Right. So I've told this story to a number of my friends and my family as well. That my first duty assignment was as a second lieutenant in the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. I was an armor officer. Got lucky enough to go into Cav. I just had always had this kind of vision of, I remember my dad telling me stories of the charge of the Light Brigade when I was growing up, and Custer and all that. So, joining the cavalry was this big deal for me from a personal standpoint. I met this young lieutenant, a good friend of mine, Darby McNulty, young Irish kid. His dad went to West Point, maybe weighed 135, 140 pounds soaking wet, short guy. And this guy was probably one of the best young officers I had ever served with, because he was motivated. He knew how to talk to people. He knew he was smart. He was tactically competent. He didn't care about what other people thought of him, and wasn't afraid to lead and take chances and be risky. And that's where I was like, well, God, if he can do it, I can too, right? And it wasn't until I became really good friends with him and started kind of having some of that, that persona and that leadership aura kind of bleed over to me, that I was like, oh, I can do this too. So I think part of it too is being some cases fortunate enough to just be learning, not just from leaders but also your peers about leadership and being okay with it.
Yeah.
And I don't think I was comfortable enough to. Certainly I was at West Point. I don't think I was comfortable enough to do that, just to be okay to learn from my peers about how to be a good leader.
I want to ask this, and I want to ask you too, Scott, in comparison, because you guys took totally different paths to becoming an officer, right? And one of the things I've noticed from being around a lot of officers and speaking commander at a high level is the West Point officers have a strong business and work acumen, right? Mm-hmm. But maybe are not as developed socially.
Right. Yeah. And certainly not in terms of how they dress, right?
Right. Well, just in how they act.
For the listeners, Greg's a pretty good dresser.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, when that 03 is, when the captain is sitting there, on staff,
right?
The West Point guy, you can tell because he's not leaving. Never going to leave the office.
Right.
He's just going to sit there the whole time deployed. But then you have a guy like Scott who's like enlisted. Didn't you go to school, and you have a different work ethic, not lack of for either one of you, but socially, you were going to probably be pretty strong. You're going to probably associate with the officers. You still have the work thing, but how do you think that's right? Or you
how do I associate with them? I don't know. I don't know how the combination of being a Mustang. I've said it 1,000 times. Like, being enlisted never made me a better officer, but I never thought about it from the social setting.
And I don't mean like you're getting along well. I just mean that your ability to work within a staff would probably be more developed as opposed to.
I think the real challenge, and you could call bullshit on this too, Greg, is I think when you have worked at a lower level and you have been very hands-on, when you get in a position of leadership or where you have to delegate responsibility, sometimes that's hard to do, and you want to do things yourself instead of being patient, waiting for people to succeed or fail, instead of saying, hey, Daddis, you were supposed to have that report to me by 1600, or you were supposed to have the trucks cleaned by this time, and holding them accountable. Like, that is the real challenge of leadership, is to really not get involved sometimes.
Mentorship is not so clean and cut, right, that you've got to let things go. And I don't know, the West Point thing, it's funny. We always used to joke when I was a lieutenant, like the best compliment you could get from an NCO that you respected was, hey, you don't act like a West Pointer. Like that was the best compliment.
Same thing in the academy for Naval Academy guys.
Because you can see it for sure.
And I think that's unfair to the academies, but it was always that, if you were able to,
they've done it to themselves. They've got no sympathy.
Right. If you if you got invited out for a beer to a local dive bar in El Paso with a bunch of NCOs that you respected, that was that was better than a grade efficiency report. It was just that you were able to. And
your shot record needs to be updated. In El Paso, very close to Juarez.
But when you do show up there in that bar, in that cantina, and you're like, I've got on my chinos and my English braid belt. And
Thanks for translating for the listeners. Bar and cantina. That was good.
But there is still a difference where you're like, oh, I can relax in this cantina. Yeah, exactly. I don't have to be
And it's not so neat, right? I mean, I worked for plenty of officers that were non-West Point graduates that that were there to work. I had 2 tours in Korea, and there was plenty of attitudes of, well, we're in Korea, we've got nothing else to do, so you might as well work for 18 hours a day. And then you'd have plenty of officers that were waiting for the commander to leave. Because God forbid you left before the commander left. That's just bad. That's just awful all the way around, right?
That's something we've never talked about, really, is the work day. The military work day. Everyone hears, we work in combat, and we talk about that, but we don't talk about the staff shit that consumes pretty much the majority of your career. And how you balance that. Like Greg says, I'm going to work a 16-hour work day. But conversely, being in the private sector now, and I look at some of the things, staying so connected with the military and even the stuff we're doing today, like to get something back from someone in the military out to the private sector is a challenge. So they don't have, it's just such a completely different work ethic. But it's totally geared towards warfighting capabilities in the military. And I don't think that there's, they want to share that with the outside world, where we are in a position now where we want to reach in and kind of help them.
Well, it's funny. I've heard plenty of folks in academia now that I'm full-time professor at Chapman, where they'll just ask, well, how did you get this done? And I'm thinking, I'm just doing basic staff officer stuff that senior lieutenants and young captains do. It's what we're talking about. And I think you're exactly right, Scott, that you don't think about that. Even if you're deployed more in terms of our recent experience with Iraq and Afghanistan, you're still spending, at least 60-70% of your careers doing staff work type of stuff.
And the staff work enables and propels everything else to go down range, the plans and the movement and logistics. And I remember those workup periods, you're just begging to go on deployment, because preparing for the deployment was
worse
so
than
much
the deployment itself. Right.
Yeah, I'd rather be shot at than be in the the pre-combat box waiting.
Right.
So, do you see a stark difference between how you interact with coworkers from the military to in academia? I mean, what a stark difference is that? Or have you always been this smooth, steady, unflappable guy that kind of pulls.
I mean, I
dissecting.
I think we all aspire to that as officers, right? And I mean, how many
I never
memoirs?
made it.
Yeah, right. But seriously, how many memoirs have we read growing up, either in high school or coming forward, where you read about somebody like Phil Caputa's Rumor of War, or those types of memoirs where these officers talk about what's most important. They're not scared of getting shot at war.
Right.
They're scared of not performing their duties well in war. They're scared of looking scared. They're afraid of not being able to measure up and not be unflappable. So I think we all aspire to that. I don't think I've approached my colleagues in academia any differently than I have. Some of the best advice I got early on, and I'm sure the same way from NCOs, was, a good portion of leadership is just listening and having conversations rather than just doing this, being directive, right?
Yeah.
And doing the chopping hand thing. And I found that to be a useful advice, right?
I give
this
that
interplay.
Do you find yourself giving that advice? I give that advice now, and I think I was the worst person of taking that advice.
Yeah, right. And I still, and
it's so ironic from a guy that, like, I'm sitting here, I'm doing podcasts, I'm running my mouth most of the time.
Right.
I get paid for public speaking,
right.
and I'm always giving my opinions. So I feel, am I a hypocrite for giving that advice, or is that sage advice? From the sage in the room, can I get a ruling? And Craig? Yes? Sage. Craig says sage. Craig?
Yeah, I think it is.
Pete? I don't know. All right, I'll keep using it. Whatever.
And I think, we all get emotional. We all tend to shut down sometimes when we don't want to hear competing advice. Sometimes you can't. You just want to make a decision. I have found that things move a lot more slowly in academia, I'm assuming the civilian world as well, than in the military, because you're not in a hierarchical organization. There are plenty of times where I miss being in a hierarchical organization because things just happen. And, in that sense, I think leadership is a little bit easier because you can just direct things and be directed.
What's the best piece of advice that you have taken? Someone said to you.
In terms of leadership, I think the best piece of advice I got was that, and I can't remember where it was. I want to say it was like like a captain's career course or something like that, where you're going to all these classes on tactics and leadership, and I remember somebody, and I don't remember the individual, but said, don't make leadership too hard. That it's just not that hard, right? That if you listen, if you treat people well, if you just do basic communication skills, if you're, obviously if you're tactically and technically competent, that don't overthink leadership, right? That it sometimes I think we have to read all these primers and think about checklists and am I doing this right as a leader? At some point it's just not that hard, right? It's just basic human skills of being good to people and taking care of them. And I just wonder sometimes if we try and overthink leadership a little too much.
I like that, because I don't think any school we've ever been to said, like, leadership should be fun.
Yeah, right.
You
right.
never fucking hear that. Like, but you should enjoy what you do, and the effects of being a good leader, knowing and being satisfied. Yeah, and sometimes you never see it.
Well, I'm seeing it in terms of how you feel. Like, you just feel.
Yeah, like you're taking care of your men and women. And
we got back from my first tour in Iraq in Desert Storm, so I'm dating myself a little bit.
You're a good company. Craig's here.
Yeah, that's true.
See, I told you it would come in handy, Craig. It's good to have the sage.
So we had a very technically competent commander that took us through Desert Storm. And then after that, as a lot of folks did after we got back, there was a change of command. We had a staff officer come in who was just phenomenal, just a good guy, technically competent, good guy, drove a Harley to work. I mean, just all around good guy, right? You felt it in the unit, right? You just felt, he never came out and said anything, but you just felt there was something there with him. And then he left 18 months, 2 years later, and we had somebody else in, and it was my last 6 months as an executive officer for the cavalry troop. And we had somebody come in, great guy, but just wasn't confident in himself, wasn't confident and you felt that too. And to me, that was a huge learning point, right? That individuals can have a difference. And here, it's nothing stated, right? It was just how two very different commanders held themselves.
What do you call that? Not even a technical term, but what would you call it? that quality?
That quiet competence.
Yeah.
You know, that it's nothing overbearing. It's just this guy, two very different captains. One came to work every day and, like you said, loved what he was doing, was good at what he was doing. I think knew he was good at it, but didn't have to tell everybody he was good at it. And then another commander coming in and, none of the lieutenants had changed, none of the platoon sergeants had changed, and within about a month, the unit felt different. And so, to me, that was another example of how leadership makes.
I call it force of personality from like a military lens, but I think some people would call it charisma.
Yeah, without a doubt, right.
And I don't think you have to be boiling over life of the party type guy to have charisma by whatever sense of definition, but that does drive unit.
Makes a difference.
Morale, and cohesion, and just a sense of passion, I think is the word I use most frequently now. What's the worst piece of advice you've ever gotten on leadership? Like, you're going to be a great leader if you do this, and you think you either did it.
It was at West Point, and we still say it, right? Listen to your NCOs over and over and over again, because it got to the point where the message was, don't do anything.
Right.
Unless you're listening to your NCOs. And this is, I think, I want to make sure I explain myself here, is that
to all the NCOs listening, it's going to get better.
That's right,
me.
Is that, yes, I graduated from West Point. I went to a couple Army career courses, and I'm green, and I don't know everything that I need to know about my branch and the technical aspects and the tactical aspects and leadership. But I also know something, right? And just because you've been in the Army for 15 years as an NCO doesn't mean you're hot shit. It may be you've been in the Army for 15 years and you've just been an average or even below average NCO. And to me, there's this, midpoint you've got to get in terms of following the advice of your NCOs, taking the advice, but not being beholden to it and not being confident enough to say, I don't know about that. Because my red flag always went up when I had an NCO go, sir, let me tell you, I've been in the Army for 15 years, and this is how we've always done it. Whoa. Just because you've been doing it for 15 years doesn't mean it's been right. And just because I'm a young 22, 23-year-old lieutenant doesn't mean I'm not smart enough to call you on it and say, hey, maybe you've been doing this wrong for 15 years. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not challenging your service for the last 15 years. I'm not challenging you as an NCO, but I also don't have to bow down and believe everything.
I think that's a great point. And Pete, feel free to jump in on this, because if he's like, yeah, brother, I'm picking up what you're laying down, breaking it down. That's an interesting point, because you talked earlier about listening. Yeah. Make sure you're a good listener. Right. I got the exact same advice. Right. And they said the NCOs are this, and listen to them. I especially at entry-level leadership, when you're a young lieutenant and you don't want to make mistakes. You want these bolsters around you to safeguard you from toppling over. It is important, but to everyone who's listening to this conversation, this applies not only to the military, but in the private sector. Whatever you're doing in life as a leader, someone who has legitimate authority or is in a position of responsibility, is when you have the training and background that you do, and you come through this phenomenal institution called West Point, the United States Military Academy. When you're thrust into those positions, one of the things that most leaders don't do is evaluate their people and listen. Like, if you listen to them, then you can find out who the NCOs are. But if you blindly go in with bad advice, and that's a great thing about advice. Some's good, some's bad. You can take some, you can leave some. I never get my feelings hurt if people don't take my advice. I never profess it's the best. But they also have to realize, even at a senior or mid-level management positions, these and it could be an officer or a non-commissioned officer. I don't care. If you don't listen to your people and evaluate them, they could be so far out in left field. Or you look at a guy, especially in the military. This could apply in academia. I don't know. You can give me a ruling on it. But you look at someone, they have all these degrees on the wall, they got all this rank on their sleeve, and you think, well, he must know a ton. Well, in reality, you see Staff Sergeant, this god, right? He wields all this power over 50 men. But in reality, he's been on recruiting duty or in a job where it's totally not related to, especially what we did as infantry guys. Right. And so now his skills atrophy for 3 or 4 years. Right. And I think that's a regret I have at certain levels is not sitting down and talking and say, hey, what are you comfortable? What more training do you need?
So there's a balance there, right? That you've got to be able to listen, but just the fact that I'm listening doesn't mean I have to lay down and not have any influence at all, right? I got lucky. My very first platoon sergeant, David Crenshaw.
Hey, Dave.
I still remember him.
Is Dave out there?
I don't know. I haven't talked to him in a long time. And he was 6 months away from retiring. And I thought I was going in and just going to get like the worst platoon sergeant because I saw him, right? And he's got like hair coming out of his, T-shirt and his long, and he's got his grizzled face and this big bushy mustache. And they're drinking beer in the office at 4:30, 5 o'clock, after the day's done. And I'm like, oh crap! And we had a couple Vietnam veterans in the still in the CAV troop, and I'm thinking, oh my god, right? The first time I met him, he's sitting in the corner of the office, a couple other old salty NCOs. And they're just drinking beer, and I'm like, oh, shit. And he pulled me aside, and he was like, look, I'm going to make you a promise. I've got 6 months left in the Army, and I'm going to give you everything I got. And it was awesome. And together, we had to fire a staff sergeant, one of the tank commanders, because he just wasn't pulling his weight. And, Dave took me through all that, and did it in a way where I learned a lot from him, but he was also willing to do it in a way because he understood, how to mentor, to do it so we never felt like we were in competition with each other. Was always good about pulling me aside if he had something or he was questioning what I was wanting to do. And so, it was a true relationship, which was, I think,
that's
important, right?
Luck where it comes into play a little bit.
It really is.
And, Greg's rearing from the academy to commissioning, vice mine, being enlisted, I say this a lot, is to other Marine Corps officers that everything you learned about officering came from NCOs and staff NCOs. So you do need to listen to them and understand that role. Right. Vice, the majority of instructors at the academies, the service academies, they're officers.
Right.
So that's where you really, I say, again, just lose a little perspective or aren't afforded that perspective because of the insulation that those types of, institutions have.
Yeah, the good part with West Point, right, is that you've got this rotating faculty. So, the bulk of the officers that are teaching there have just left company level command, gone on to get their master's degree, and then are at West Point for 3 years, and then they go back out in the Army. So you're kind of always getting this fresh blood in, which I think is important.
I want to go back for a second and say, when you talk about Dave, your NCO, just for the audience so they understand, when you're 6 months from retirement, here's how short you are. It's not that you don't give a fuck. It's that nobody gives a fuck that you don't give a fuck. Really, he could have just skated and said, "Oh yeah, you're stuck,"
because he deserved it, right? He'd been in the Army for well over, it was over. I know it was over 22 and a half. It might have been 25 years. I mean, so there was, and there would have been someone who would have picked up the slack. But the fact that he didn't speaks a lot to his character. And I think Scott's right that it was complete luck, right? Because it could have gone the complete opposite way, and my first experience as lieutenant would have been 180 degrees opposite, and would have been awful.
What do they say to the lieutenant you tease could wind up being your commanding officer one day? So be careful, how much shit you give them.
Right. Greg, a minute ago you were asked for the best advice you could give maybe a young person today.
Yeah.
Best advice I ever heard was they said, "Look good on paper. You don't expect to be able to talk your way through life." What do you think about that as advice to a young person?
Best advice to look good on paper?
Look good on paper. Get credentialed, get an education.
Oh, no,
look good on paper.
I would argue that's the worst advice.
Exactly. How so?
Again, I mean, all this is a balance, right? That I think, if you have any aspirations of moving upward in the organization, you've got to hit certain gates, right? That if I'm an armor officer, I've got to be a platoon leader. I've got to be a company level commander. I've got to be an operations officer as a major. But, if you're just chasing an efficiency report, everybody's going to see that.
And not necessarily an efficiency report as far as the military, but even outside the military, so that when you look at a person's bio on paper, anybody looking at it would say, boy, this is a person I'd like to talk to.
Yeah, I don't know. To me, it works the opposite way, right? That I think what you said, right? That if you're having a good time, and if you're passionate about what you're doing, the paper is just going to work itself out. And I've seen plenty of officers that have made career decisions based on, I need this job, because if I don't get it, I'm not going to get this job, which gets me to the third job, which is what I really want. And it never works out that way. It just doesn't. Because I think most importantly, if you're looking at a career either in the military or I would argue outside, everybody around you is going to see that, right? That your soldiers, I mean, at least
they can smell fear.
Yeah,
they're
exactly,
like dogs,
right.
They're
so in other words,
rare breed of
you don't wanna
animals.
be a person that looks good on paper, but really isn't up to par.
No, I think the paper trail, the paper piece of it works itself out if your heart's in the right place as a leader, right? If you signed up to be an infantry officer in the Marine Corps, if I signed up to be an armor officer in the Army because that's what I wanted to do, the paper is just going to work itself out.
Can you do that as an officer in the Army? You get guaranteed a job.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero, co-host of the Break It Down Show and fellow producer here at Lions Rock Productions. And I'm proud to announce our newest show. It's called Justice. Season 1 is going to be a deep dive into some of the cases I personally worked on as a licensed private investigator, and you'll get a unique view into the criminal justice system that may just challenge some of your personal notions about how it should work and open your eyes in ways you never imagined. So keep your ears open for Justice, a brand new podcast from Lions Rock Productions to iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
The paper is just going to work itself out.
Can you do that as an officer in the Army? You get guaranteed a job.
No, you're not guaranteed.
You're just guaranteed to be an officer.
Yeah, you're just
it's
guaranteed.
Same as the Marine Corps.
Right. Yeah,
I want to transition this into your work at Chapman, where you can get an MA program in War and Society.
Yeah.
So I want to give you the best advice I ever heard, which came from an Afghanistan leader. He was a district leader, but also an imam.
Right.
So like a really well-respected guy and a mujahideen fighter, right? So he's a warrior, he's a holy man and an educated man and a government leader.
Yeah.
And he said this, and in this fight in particular, and this is where I want to get into your War and Society stuff, it's really important because he said there's room for one sword in the scabbard.
Right.
And if we're going to teach and train, if we're going to advise and create capacity, even that colonel, that general who with the Army uniform on has to go, I can't be that sword. I can build him a badass scabbard, but where does this guy want to go? And so it's so hard, right? As a commander, like, I'm supposed to impose my will. I'm supposed to accomplish these things. But if you don't allow that person to, and like Scott was saying, there's going to be failure when it's an Afghan guy or an Iraqi guy. Right. They're not going to lead and do things the way we do. So talk to me a little bit about that as you teach people, and these are mid-career people that are coming in for a master's. So how do you impart that kind of wisdom into people that likely have never had to go and get shot at or whatever, whatever their backgrounds are?
So the way we've developed the program, in a sense, I think I used my experience at West Point, the history department, to think about this graduate program at Chapman. And to me, the way we taught history at West Point was with purpose, right? That it wasn't simply
you missed a beat, though, so listeners understand. Not only is Greg a massive overachiever, graduated from West Point, successful career, then was asked to come back and teach at West Point because he had done. That's who. So then he comes back. But that's important.
So
moving right along.
Yeah, well,
right. Sorry, but but I can't just.
The larger piece about I think this is my bias now as a historian. I think what West Point did really, really well is that it wasn't simply about reading about the second day at Gettysburg and being like, okay, I need to know what squad is going here, what squad is going here. It was more teaching history to have an impact on you as a professional, right? How can this make you a better officer? If I understand the relationships between war and society, how will that make me a better officer, especially as I'm getting to higher levels? I always told my cadets that I'm teaching you not to be a better second lieutenant. I'm teaching you to be a better senior level leader. And I basically took that vision from West Point and tried to apply it here at Chapman, where the idea was that this wasn't a military history program where we're going to sit and rub our chins and think about battle tactics, because that's
Who
important.
doesn't love sitting around rubbing their chin?
Yeah, I love doing that.
Some days I do that.
Pete Longstreet says.
But what we want to do was sit over a bottle of scotch and talk more theoretical. But no, seriously, like the idea was, we had these 3 pillars for the program that we wanted to take a look at how and why societies went to war, how they experienced war, and I think perhaps most importantly, how they deal with war's consequences. And for me, that's what we don't talk about enough. We don't talk about the consequences of using military force enough. Now, to get to your point, your example with the Afghan imam, what we try to do, especially when students first come into our program, we teach a core war and society program, and the idea with our course, and the idea with that is just to give you a wide array to show you that this is a pretty complex topic, right? So we'll read a book about social mobilization and what it means to be an American citizen. So the relationships between ideas about American citizenship and military service. We'll read a book about the Taliban and how it makes sense, right? That we have this, I think, popular culture in the United States views the Taliban in this kind of weird way where it conflates Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and they're all just fanatical Islamic terrorists. And rather, we read a book by Ahmad Rashid that talks about the Taliban as a social movement that's born out of war, that makes complete sense in its context. We read a book on the destruction of architecture in war. We read a book about the environment and how trying to gain political control is complicated by gaining control over the landscape and geography. So the idea is to get students that may not have specific military experience to understand how encompassing war can be, socially, politically, culturally.
Objectives in terms of the program would be what we learning from the past might help us avoid doing the same things in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a key piece of it. Now, I always tell my students, I don't want you to come away with a checklist from history, right? That if you're reading about the Vietnam War, I don't want you to come out with a top 10. These are the things we should do. These are the things we shouldn't do. And if we only apply them to Iraq, we would have won. To get to your point, I think that it's perspective, right? That if you do this well in terms of studying war, that you'll have better perspective in terms of how we're applying it today and in the future. And we just don't do it very well.
You
right?
talked about, and something that resonates directly with me because it's part of what I've discovered from being out and talking to these folks,
Yeah.
and you have to be able to win at least with 5 elements. And, we can discuss that part, but that's not really the point. It's militarily, of course, it has to be a bit of permissive environment to actually get work done.
Right.
But culturally, socially, politically, and through religion.
Yeah,
if you can't deal in those 5 things,
Yeah.
as far as I understand it, with a lot of experience, you can't win in the modern fight.
No, and I think that modern fight could expand all the way back to post-World War II era, right? That what I've been more and more fascinated as I've been studying about Vietnam in particular, right, is that we have these grand expectations for what war can do for us. We believe, we have this almost religious faith that war can be socially transformative, that if we apply military force in the right way, we can change societies abroad. And we've had that faith for a long time, right? That we come out of World War II, where this unilateral power or this global power for the first time in the history of the United States. And we just have this faith that, if we get the right strategy with the right general and the right resources, man, we can do anything. And to me, that's what's so interesting about Vietnam. It's the first time I think Americans are confronted with the possibility that there are limits to American power. And I think one of the things you've seen our nation wrestle with, especially in terms of military incursions abroad, since the Vietnam War, is that very question, right? What are the limits of American power? And it's just something that's
40 years
really
later.
uncomfortable to talk about, right? Think about what politician is going to get up on the political stump and say, look, our foreign policy is flawed right now because there are limits to the United States power abroad.
Yeah.
You know how quickly your campaign is going to be over if you're running for office? Immediately, right?
Would you say there are limits to our power, or would you say, while our power may be unlimited, there should be limits in how we use it?
No, our power is limited, without a doubt.
There's not proficiency across that spectrum of elements, right? So Scott's going to teach and train his Marines to be a killing machine because that's their damn job, right? They're like, oh, by the way, don't forget to engage shakes and don't forget to negotiate these things. Right. And so I'll tell you right now, the Army doctrine on how to use an interpreter is decades old. Yeah. And in the counterintelligence manual, right, where you're going to talk to people all the time, it's approximately 3,500 words. Yeah. And if you look in the basic skills manual on how to deploy mines and claymores, same number of words. Right. So how can you be proficient in these things where you have to be compelling? Right. If there's not even any Scott knows, like, if my Marine can't hit a target at 400 meters, I know how to get that guy fixed.
Scott and I have talked about this, and I'll plug one of my books, Westmoreland's War, and the standard narrative of Vietnam, right, is that we lost in Vietnam. One of the narratives is we lost in Vietnam because we had a bad general in Westmoreland, and all he wanted to do was kill. Right. Just focus on attrition, body counts, search and destroy.
World War II tactics.
That's the argument, right? Come to find out, the United States Army and the Marine Corps in Vietnam were much more holistic in their approach. They understood that this was a population security environment. They understood that you couldn't kill your way to victory. They understood that there was an economic aspect and social component and political component. And they tried to apply it. And they actually, I think, had a pretty comprehensive strategy. That strategy still came up short. And part of the problem, I think, is just thinking about what you're asking young 19, 20, 21-year-old soldiers and Marines to do, right? Because you're asking them to kill, and you're also asking them to do something much bigger. So the way I like to tell my students, right, is you're asking them to destroy something at the same time you're asking them to build something. And that's incredibly difficult to do. I think we had a hard time with it in Vietnam. I think we're having clearly a hard time with it more recently. Because it takes so much maturity to decide, when do I kill and when do I build?
So 40 years has gone by.
And we're still doing it.
Are we repeating the same mistakes of history?
Yeah, I think there's some – I think you could I think there's some similarities, certainly, right? But I think what you're also seeing, again, from the political side of it, is that you still have this faith, right? You still have the faith that military power can be transformative. The reason we lost in Afghanistan, because we just didn't have the right general. We didn't have the right amount of troops.
We turned the corner.
Right? We didn't have
turning the corner.
We didn't have the right strategy. Yes. Right? We didn't have the right surge at the right time, or the surge wasn't long enough, or we didn't have the right local leaders in place. And yet we still have this faith that war can deliver for us. And sometimes there's times more recently now, as I've looked back upon, especially I think the last 50, 60 years, is we need to be okay questioning those assumptions more. Because strategy is about assumptions, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to ask a young Marine to do basic things. And those skill sets are the building blocks for strategy, obviously. But when you get to those higher levels, you've got to start making assumptions, right? I'm going to assume that if I give you security, you're going to turn that security into momentum on the political side.
This also goes back, like, that strategic and that theoretic plan, that outcome isn't tied to the tactics. And quite often, I'll say most of the time, the tactics aren't tied to the ground truth. Right. So you got people going out and executing things. And I'll give you an example, and this will go back to my thing on orientation. It's not that we need to win hearts and minds. It's that Afghan leader needs to win hearts and minds. Yeah. He's actually the governor. Right. And if we can't move that political power, even if it's just an inch or two over during our deployment, then no matter what we think we've done, no matter we opened up Route Fox or whatever, that's all bullshit, because he hasn't been able to collect the elders and then push through. Like, if I go out a mile from and I've done this, if I go out from the mile from the government center, I say, what goes on in that building? And they laugh. Right. We got a real problem. Right. And that's that skill set, being able to orient on that and going, it's not us. Who cares if we get credit for this? What I care is that, Muhammad has credit for it.
Yeah. So two things here. This is funny. I think you're exactly right. That the challenge of linking tactical successes to political and strategic momentum is probably one of the most difficult things to do in the kind of wars that we're fighting today. That you may be, as a company level commander, tactically proficient in counterinsurgency fighting in terms of getting your Marines to understand the challenges of employing force at the tactical level, so you're not being overbearing, that you're not turning local civilians away from you, you're bringing them toward you. And you may be incredibly good at that. In fact, your brothers on either side of you at the battalion level may be incredibly good at it. Now, to be able to replicate that in this multi-provincial war and turn that tactical acumen and proficiency into something political is incredibly hard to do. Right?
And those two vehicles, this is just my opinion, those two vehicles are not even driving down the same road.
Right.
They're not even driving down the same type of road in the same state, possibly in the same country, for that matter, in what we've been doing in this long war. And what I think is really cool, all the tactics aside, is the program that you teach at Chapman is something I wish we had the opportunity to teach at lower levels to younger guys, so they had this baseline of understanding of culture, and not only the culture in the military and applying that to wars we fight, but bringing that home to America to let everyone know that these are things that we create within our society, and that small percentage of the military is not just this rote lockstep force that goes out with a rifle on their shoulder and kills bad guys, and hopefully we wave a flag at the end. You're building an understanding. So to your students who are looking through the course catalog, or prospective students, and they say, I'm going to take this course because it sounds cool, war and society. What are they going to learn from it? What do you hope to teach them from so much experience?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is the consequences, if not unintended consequences, of militarizing our foreign policy. That getting them to hopefully be in positions of influence, whether it's teaching or being in a think tank or hopefully advising policymakers, that there's got to be more in the toolkit besides the military hammer. It's an essential part of our foreign policy and national security. I'm not advocating for pacificate. I'm not a pacifist. Let me take that back. I probably, as I'm getting older, more of a pacifist, but I understand that peace is not coming anytime soon. But I think to get policymakers to understand, again, that there are unintended consequences to the use of military force, and that we may be part of the problem when we use military force, right?
Yeah, I don't think
that's a hard thing to do.
I would disagree with you. I don't think you're transitioning towards pacifism is so much as it is understanding that you've applied yourself, you've educated yourself, and you're now in a position where you can share all of that experience. And I think you can only bang yourself in the thumb with a hammer before you got to hit the nail, man. Right. You're not going to keep doing that.
Well, the problem is, I think that we've so intertwined our sense of patriotism and nationalism with military, with the armed forces, that, and we've talked about this before, Scott, that we've conflated questioning military policy with dishonoring the veteran. That if I question the billions of dollars spent on defense, or whether or not we should stay in Syria or get out of Syria, or what should our larger policy be in the Middle East, that we shy away from those hard discussions because politically there is a sense that if you do that, you're going to open yourself up for being attacked by the other side as not supporting the veteran. And I think that's a dangerous place for us right now, that we've kind of overcompensated from the Vietnam era, right? That we've swung from the standard story of spitting on veterans coming home from Vietnam to this unthinking adulation of the veteran that has, I would argue, narrowed public debate about whether force should be applied or not in terms of trying to achieve our policy aims. And so that's, I think, one of our objectives too, is to get folks more comfortable with talking about this, and to, in a sense, depoliticize that portion of the conversation, right? To have a more open and honest conversation of what can we expect when we use military force? What are the consequences? How do you work with locals and to come to a mutual understanding? I think we've seen this from Vietnam forward, right? That it's been incredibly difficult to to align your policy objectives with the objectives of those on the ground, and that we have this kind of sense that our policy objectives should drive decision making at the local level.
How difficult is that for you now that you're Dr. Daddis teaching this, and we all come from the ground level where we fully understand there's a time for talking and there's a time for doing, but now you are completely, I don't say completely, but that's your role now. Right. You are the talker. You're the deep thinker. How important is it to you to find a way that the doers and the talkers and the thinkers
come together?
Yeah, right. Like where is that throughput? How do we get there to take all the things we screwed up during this war, during past wars, and apply them? How frustrating is that for you, or to find that conduit?
Well, I mean, isn't this what you're all about, right? Of trying to create those linkages between your personal experiences and to get the civilian population that may not have direct experience with the military to understand what it means to be a veteran, what it means to serve overseas, to get them to think about embracing a veteran more than just sticking a yellow ribbon on your bumper. And so I think conversations like this, I do think that serving on a faculty at West Point for an infantry or an armor officer who spent time deployed and then to go get their master's degree and then go and teach and then go back out into the force and then hopefully rise to the level of the senior leaders. I think when you look at folks like Mattis, like McMaster, they understand the value of education. Again, it's a hard thing to do, right? I think how much of your time is consumed as a company commander just doing day-to-day tasks to be tactically competent? How much time do you have to think about these broader issues of strategy and policy and the unintended consequences of force? And I'm just trying to make sure the Marines can hit at 400, 400 meters.
Well, that whole thing goes into a concept I've been working on of miscomfort, and I know that's not really a word, but it is, because these modern conflicts require an officer to be able to withstand that. Like, okay, every gallon of sweat is turned to,
right.
all that nonsense. But the reality is that tanker, who is a fantastic officer and goes through NTC and fires tables and qualifies his tank, is not going to sit in his tank for 1 second once he gets to combat zone. He's going to go out on patrols. He's going to be in an MRAP. And that requires a lot of ability to understand that you're not going to be comfortable, but it does not mean that you can't develop comfort in that fight. It's just you can't go and worry about tanking. Like, it has nothing to do with the modern fight.
And yet you still need to be competent in your individual branch.
So as an artillery officer, you got to look at all your long gunners and go, all this stuff, we're not going to focus on it.
Right.
Pre-deployment here for us is going to be about developing capacity in the.
And I think at least I don't know if the Marine Corps is the same way. I know the Army has been struggling with that, especially post-Iraq. That should they return back to the kind of basic core competencies of their branch? And in my branch there was a lot of hand wringing throughout the entire time we were in Iraq. When you've got units deploying and leaving their tanks home, and what is that going to mean for the next next war?
Because you guys' things like death before dismount, and then the next thing you hear is dismount. Right. Oh, fuck! That's that miscomfort. How do I get comfortable out of my zone?
Again, I think this is really challenging, not just for officers, but I think for the soldiers that are implementing the policy. Right, that you're asking them to do a hell of a lot, and it takes so much maturity to get it right. And one of the books I read, it was a memoir from Iraq, and I can't remember which one, and it was a scene where. They basically got bad intel. They went into the wrong house and they killed somebody by accident. And they've been making all these gains locally. And one bad intel, one bad mission, and just set them back in the local neighborhood, they said by months at least, right? And so that's the other problem here, is that there's such a fine line in terms of making mistakes here and having those mistakes really outweigh months worth of gain. It's just so difficult, right?
As a culture, I would say that civilians are basically pacifists by culture. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, I think to an extent. I think I think just based on Christian Judeo values of how our society grows up, that we don't, we kind of live by the golden rule, and you're not, the 10 Commandments of not killing anyone. Although I think we are very much a society that values military service, right? That there's still military service, I think, is still seen as one of the best ways to become a man, as an example, right? So I think there's.
Would you say that our highest value is probably freedom, and that if pushed to the wall, then and only then would we want to react?
No, I think our policy is more realist in terms of we deploy military forces for much more than just freedom or democracy. I think we're certainly, I think we define our national security more than just our values, without a doubt.
I think Greg just said something, the military makes you, a stronger man or something. But in this generation, this era, we're seeing now on the news this week, the integration of female platoons and entry-level training. Right. Just retweeted a great post about the first female Marine who graduated the Mountain Leaders course in Bridgeport, California. And the reason I'm bringing this up is one of the things I was most impressed with is I was invited up to sit in on one of Greg's classes is the large predominance of females in the class, and not military, but they just, it's impressive to me. Yeah. Just utterly impressive that we're addressing, and that Chapman University and Greg, they're addressing the other 50% that Selena's talked about, that I've talked about, that I feel are so vital to becoming a better country, to becoming a better military, and being viewed as a real world leader in these developing and emerging countries where this isn't even consideration. And what I loved about all the haters when you see these historic milestones of females crushing it and meeting the standard and not redefining the standard in and of itself, but they're really putting themselves in such a great position to make us better. And I wanted to respond back to all the haters, but instead I just remarked that these are firsts for the U.S. Marine Corps. And that's why we've been kicking ass and taking names for 243 years, is because we do things first. Right. And that's not exclusive to the Marine Corps. Obviously, I'm biased, but that's why, because we do it first and we implement it, we make it happen. And I think the program at Chapman is such a, I don't like to use the word groundbreaking, but it is.
No,
I mean, it really is.
We did our homework, and we wanted to have a program that was unique, that talked about these things, because they're clearly important. And I think, I think once you kind of break that ceiling, you're not going back, right? So,
And I think the predominance of those serving on active duty, it's a non-issue to them. The predominance of them, and even people.
I was at West Point when the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell happened, and there was all this kerfuffle ahead of time, and senior level leaders about what this was going to do, and not just in the Army as a whole, but at West Point, and it was repealed. The Corps cadets collectively just shrugged their shoulders, like,
it wasn't even a ripple in the pond.
It wasn't.
It's no big deal.
And I don't care what you have in between your legs or what you do with what's in between your legs. Leadership is leadership is leadership. And as long as, again, it's the right person for the right job for the right reason, if you apply that as the person who's in charge, you're going to have a great company. You're going to have a great unit.
If you're a war fighter, there's no gender in that. Just go out and be a pro, work hard. And if you're not a pro yet, working hard.
We've got, I think, the haters and the trolls, I think, are just kind of.
But they can't do enough push-ups.
Right,
I've done zero push-ups in combat.
I think that's just a cultural, hopefully a leftover of,
that's that miscomfort.
And hopefully a bygone era, right, where, previously you defined military service as a way to become a man, period. And masculinity was wrapped up into military service. And so my hope is that all this kind of crying and fussing about this is just the last gasp effort of.
I think it's a great. I just think it's a great thing to talk about because it's something I feel personally it's important. And today, the whole posting of the first female, and I saw guys like Medal of Honor recipient Dakota Meyer just ranting, dropping F-bombs about. There's guys that I've been in combat who couldn't do as many ruck marches or pull-ups, and they shouldn't have been in combat. I would rather had this. It's not even an issue. And then I was talking to an active duty major who is my XO in combat, and he has these discussions as well. And the best retort to any of those arguments I heard him say is, it's not even an argument. The decision's been made.
Right.
Going back to the glass ceiling's already been broken.
Right.
You can't put it back together.
Move on, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not even a point of discussion, although many love to talk about it. Yeah. I think this is groundbreaking, not only for the military, because we all have strong ties to it, but what you're doing, teaching.
Yeah. So my big first experience with this was before the women were allowed to serve in combat arms was when I was at West Point, and we sponsored a couple women that were cadets on the women's Army rugby team. That was if you had any question about whether women can hang, just go watch a women's Army rugby team.
It's not even physicality.
No, but these cadets were just smart. They were team players. They were willing to just go out and compete like anything you've seen. They were kids. Kids isn't the right word, but they were good kids. They were just all around good American young women, right? And that you knew they were just going to go out and crush it as officers, because when you watched them on the pitch, man, they were just letting it all hang out like any other sports team you would see anywhere else. And so that, I think, when you see that up close and personal, not just watching them compete, but then have them over the house and eat with them, I think all those fears just dissipate because you just got no reason to worry about it, right? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good, man. This has been an awesome conversation. Yeah. Thank you, Scott, for setting it up. We're out of time. We'll have to just do more of it, right?
Yeah.
Totally agree. I always tell people who are the naysayers to women in combat, where you been?
Right.
They're already in it.
Right.
They're up in gun turrets. They're running gun trucks. Right. I've seen the tiniest little thing of a woman rack a Ma Deuce. And if you can do that's soldier business right there, or service member business of some kind. You can pull that handle back and get around into the chamber. You're ready to fight with the baddest gun basically ever invented. So thank you for what you do, and let's have you come back on. Let's talk
thanks for having me. Appreciate it. This was great.